Hi there, Miss Smith again. We're going to do our lesson on multiplying and dividing integers. Just like yesterday, we're going to be using two-color counters and also number lines. So just going back to our key here, if it is a positive, we're going to use a yellow two-color counter, and that's going to be an open circle when I draw it. If it's negative, that's going to be a red two-color counter, and it's going to be a closed circle where we draw that. So we're going to start off with a problem of 3 times 2. So I know what you're saying. I know what 3 times 2 is. Great, you're already making connections to what you know. So we're looking at that, and let's think about that as 3 groups of 2. So here's a group of 2. Here's a group of 2. And here's a group of 2. So we have 3 groups of 2 there. So know what you said. Hey, you just proved there is 6. So just looking visually again, 3 groups of 2 gave us 6. Now, if we want to see that on the number line, we have we're going 1 group of 2, 2 groups of 2, 3 groups of 2, and we land on our 6. Okay, so we're going to do our division and showing a relationship between division and multiplication as we look at these integer operations. So let's look at 6 divided by 2. So what we're looking at is we're looking at our positive 6, and we're saying, okay, I need to divide that into 2 groups. So let's divide that into 2 groups. There's 1 group here and 1 group here. So we're looking 6 divided by 2, so 6 items divided into 2 groups. How many in each group? Gives us 3 in each group. When we're looking at a number line, we're going to say, okay, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. We're saying, okay, I have 6 items here. I need to divide it in 2 equal groups, and there is 3 in each group. Next, we're going to do a multiplication problem of 3 times negative 2. So we're looking at that, and that is saying 3 groups of negative 2. So here's 1 group of negative 2, 2 groups of negative 2, 3 groups of negative 2. So I know you're saying in your mind, hey, that's negative 6. So let's look at it again. 1 group of negative 2, 2 groups of negative 2, 3 groups of negative 2. That gives us negative 6. If we're looking at that at a number line, we have 1 group of negative 2, 2 groups of negative 2, 3 groups of negative 2, and we end on negative 6. Let's think of our related division fact. Negative 6 divided by negative 2. All right, so we're going to have our negative 6, 4, 6. Here's our negative 6. And we're saying, this time when I want you to think about division, I want you to think about it as how many groups of negative 2 are in negative 6. So let's look. Here's 1 group of negative 2, 2 groups of negative 2, and 3 groups of negative 2. So when we're looking at that, how many is in each? How many groups did we make? So we're looking 1 group of negative 2, 2 groups of negative 2, 3 groups of negative 2. So negative 6 divided by negative 2, there are 3 groups of negative 2 within there. So let's look at a number line. Okay, so we have negative 6. So we have negative 6. And we want to know how many groups of negative 2 are in there. There's 1 group of negative 2, 2 groups of negative 2, 3 groups of -2 in there. Thinking as you're looking at the models. Look for patterns. So our next problem that we're going to look at is -3 times 2. So what we're looking at here is the opposite of 3 groups of 2. So let's start there. Here's our 3 groups of 2. Here's 1 group, 2 group, 3 groups. But this negative right there says we want the opposite of that. Well, what's the opposite of a positive? It's a negative. So these, I'm going to find the opposite of each of those, and we end up with -6. So what does that look like in our visual? Well, we start with our 3 groups of 2, and then we want the opposite of that. So we have 3 groups of -2, which gives us -6. And I know you're thinking, what does that look like on a number line? Okay, so we want the opposite of 3 groups of 2. So when we were finding 3 groups of 2, we went in a positive direction. So we want the opposite of that. So instead of moving in a positive direction, we're going to move in a negative direction. So we're going to go, okay, here's the opposite of 1 group of 2, the opposite of 2 groups of 2, the opposite of 3 groups of 2. And we end up on -6. Going to our related division problem, -6 divided by 2. So what we're saying is, this time we're going to look and we're going to say we have -6 and we want to divide it into 2 groups. So let's start with our -6. Here's our -6. And we want to divide this into 2 groups. So 2 equal groups. So we're looking here, there's 1 group and there's 2 groups there. So when we're looking at that, how many is in each group? What is each group made up of? -3. So looking at that visually, we have our -6. We divide that into 2 groups. What is in each group? -3. On a number line, what does that look like? We have our -6. And we want to divide it into 2 equal groups. And then we look at what is in each group, and we have -3 in each group. All right, still looking for patterns, trying to make connections. I think some of you are probably going, hey, I kind of know what's going on here as you go through. Just like we did in adding and subtracting, start trying to make those connections. All right, so the last 2 problems that we're going to do, the first one is -3 times -2. And so we're thinking of that as the opposite of 3 groups of -2. Opposite of 3 groups of -2. Well, let's find our 3 groups of -2. There's 1 group, 2 group. Here's our 3 groups of -2. But we want the opposite of 3 groups of -2. So I need the opposite of your negative, which is a positive. And we end up with +6. Let's look at that again. We want the opposite of 3 groups of -2. So we're starting with 3 groups of -2. And then we want the opposite of that, which is 3 groups of +2, which gives us 6. What does that look like on the number line? So looking here. So let's think about that. If we want 3 groups of -2, we went to the left in a negative direction, but we want the opposite of those 3 groups of -2. So instead of going to the left, we're going to go the opposite way, which is going to be to the right. So we're looking at that and we're saying, okay, the opposite of 3 groups of negative 2. Well, here's the opposite of 1 group of negative 2, opposite of 2 groups of negative 2, opposite of 3 groups of negative 2, and we end up with 6. I know you're thinking, interesting. I know you're looking for that pattern there. All right, last problem. Our division problem that's related to that. 6 divided by negative 2. So let's think about this in the way of we want our 6 and we want to divide that into the opposite of 2 groups. Okay, so let's think about that. We have our 6. And we want to divide that into the opposite of 2 groups. Okay, so first of all, I need my 2 groups. Here's one group. And here's my other group. Okay, so now I've got my 2 groups, but I want the opposite of those 2 groups. Well, what's in here now are positives. So the opposite of those positives would be negatives. So when we're looking at 6 divided into the opposite of 2 groups, what makes up each of those groups? Negative 3. Okay, so let's look at that visually. We start with our 6, and we want the opposite of 2 groups. Okay, so well, here's our 2 groups. There's 1 group, 2 group, and we want the opposite of that. So the opposite of those, these become negatives. And what do we have in each group? Negative 3. Looking for patterns, looking for patterns. Okay, so let's put that on a number line. 0 here, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Negative 1, negative 2, negative 3, negative 4, negative 5, negative 6. Okay, so what this is saying is we have 6, and when we want the opposite of 2 groups, so let's start here. First of all, let's get our 2 groups. When we're looking, we have 3 in each of those, but we want the opposite of those 2 groups. We want the opposite of those. Okay, so the opposite of those are going to be negative 3 in each group. Look for patterns. What do you notice?